When John Bolton was the national security advisor of President Trump, he came to Africa and he asked African leaders to choose. He said, you must be with us or with China. You cannot be with both. Well, not one African leader, not one president, not one prime minister raised his or her hand, as far as I'm aware. Not one African nation wanted to choose. And Africa should not choose. The only meaningful foreign policy of Kenya is Kenya first. Or Cote d'Ivoire is Cote d'Ivoire first. And then you can be friends with both. And if anyone is telling you to choose, kick them out.
Erik Solheim, thank you so much for joining the NABA Perspectives podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
I'm very happy to be with you and to discuss very interesting and very important issues about the future of Africa.
Absolutely. It is in some ways the question of our generation for Africa, but we'll get into that. Before we start, we're going to be discussing Africa and the multipolar world order. For those of you who might not be familiar with your work, with your background, could you just give us a little bit of context, a little bit of background on your work and where Africa fits into that?
Well, very briefly, I was for quite some time the Norwegian Minister of Environment and International Development. I was head of the United Nations Environment Programme. I worked extensively with development aid, with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, setting the rules for development aid. I have visited, I think, 35 countries in Africa. I've been involved in a few peace processes in Africa, more so in Asia, but was involved in the South Sudan peace process and peace efforts in Burundi. So I have long background from Africa, but I've never lived in the continent, just on any number of political discussions and or events.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Right. So the topic, it's a big one. Africa and the multipolar world. There's a lot to unpack on that, and we have a few things that we want to get through. But right at the outset, let's start with this idea of a multipolar world, because there's some debate about whether or not where exactly we are heading. We all know that the world is changing. We're seeing huge geopolitical shifts, economic shifts. First question to you, are we heading into a multipolar world?
Absolutely, and there can be no doubt. I mean, we have been in a period where last 100 years, United States of America was the dominating power in the world, economically and politically. Now the United States has appeared, China. I think every nation in Africa, or at least nearly all nations in Africa, now have more trade with China than with the United States. So China is a very visible competitor to the United States in Africa. But we have a lot more. The civil war in Sudan or in other countries, second-rate nations, I mean, not in moral terms, but when it comes to power, like, say, the Emirates, Turkey are involving. There are visible presence all over Africa. India is, of course, coming in. Europe, obviously, is there. So there is a much wider number of actors who are acting, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. And every African government, of course, needs to look into how can I benefit, or my government or my nation benefit from this new geopolitical situation.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we've seen is the emergence of this really increasingly diverse picture of partners that Africa has. And as you've just said, it's not just the major powers. It's not just the US and China. You have a very broad array from the Gulf states to South America, other Asian economies, Europe, of course. Within that context, now, on the one side, you have choice. On the other hand, we are, of course, also in a climate where there's talk of a new Cold War. There's talk of new tensions between East and West, the United States and China. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen, more and more talk about how China is on the wrong side. And we've seen over the last couple of years a narrative that, African countries must be careful about who they partner with. And a lot of that conversation is that if you partner with China, that's somehow a bad thing. Now, I don't want to get fixated on China, but the question for me is, do you see this as a challenge or an opportunity for Africa? How do African countries navigate this? How ought how should they approach this kind of more complex, more dynamic environment that we're in?
Let's start with the big picture, which is the US-China competition, and then we can come to the lesser powers. Look, when John Bolton was the national security advisor of President Trump, he came to Africa and he asked African leaders to choose. He said, you must be with us or with China. You cannot be with both. Well, not one African leader, not one president, not one prime minister raised his or her hand, as far as I'm aware. Not one African nation wanted to choose. Because if you are the president of Nigeria or South Africa, but if you're the president of a small African nation, because what's meaningful is to have a very good relationship to both the United States and to China, to get investment from both, to send your students to Tsinghua in Beijing, but to Harvard in Boston, to get technology from both nations, to have people-to-people's contact with both nations, simply to be close friends with China and the United States. And Africa should not choose. The only meaningful foreign policy of Kenya is Kenya first, or Cote d'Ivoire is Cote d'Ivoire first, and then you can be friends with both. And if anyone is telling you to choose, kick them out.
Is there a concern, or do you see the potential for growing pressure to constrain that ability to choose? Could African countries find themselves boxed in, for example? Like, what comes to mind is the BRICS summit that we had in South Africa last year. There was a lot of pressure around the potential visit by the Russian president. And while it wasn't sort of explicitly said, there was this sense of, like, you're either with us or against us. Is that a concern that this pressure might mount?
I still believe we are far from how it looked like during the Cold War, when there was an absolute pressure to choose. And all over Africa, some nations, some leaders chose one be with the West and others with the Soviet Union. And if a leader went with the West, the Soviet Union will very often support guerrillas or provide weapons to those who oppose that leader, and vice versa. And the West embraced the most horrible dictators. I mean, United States sent people to Kinshasa to put poison into the food of Prime Minister Lumumba to kill him. They handed him over to the people who killed him ultimately. And for 30 years, they supported Mobutu, who brought Congo nowhere. In Liberia, they supported Samuel Doe, again, a completely incompetent and corrupt leader who brought Liberia from being one of the most successful nations in Africa to the abyss, with the full support of the United States. And the Soviet Union supported the Derg, again, a horrible, bloody government of Ethiopia. And of course, then the United States supported opponents of the Derg. And we could go on and go on. We are far, far from this. There's a very bloody, horrible civil war in Sudan. If there had been the Cold War logic, the United States would have supported one part, say the government, and the Chinese, the other part, say the rapid support forces in Sudan. We are very far from that. Both the United States and China see an interest in creating a stable Sudan, which they can work with and which can stop jihadist terrorism and which can provide economic opportunities for everyone. So let's do our utmost to make sure that we are not getting into this very, very bad situation of the Cold War. We are far from it, but we should not take steps in that direction.
Yes, and let's hope we stay far from it and we remain far from it. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the key challenges that many African economies are facing. One of the big ones that comes to mind is, of course, climate change, and linked to that, the green transition, be it in energy, be it in terms of industrial development, and so on. Within this context that we're in now, do you see more opportunities for African economies to tackle this in a meaningful way? And how does a multipolar world help to support that?
China is the indispensable nation for the global green development. People in the West haven't realized it yet, but China is now 60% of solar, wind, hydropower, electric batteries, electric cars, electric buses, high-speed rail, metros, whatever green technology you can think of. China is 60% or more. Yes, it's possible to establish solar industry without China. just that it will be so much more expensive that is not a real option for anyone, and particularly not for developing nations. So any developing nation in Africa who wants to go green need a good relationship to China. And frankly, the United States of America is highly unlikely to be able to compete in the short run. They don't have the industrial ecosystem of China. As an example, the United States has constructed exactly 0 kilometers of high-speed rail. China, in the last 15 years, has constructed 45,000 kilometers of high-speed rail that circumvented the globe once. Well, is it likely that the United States will be a prime driver of rail connections in Africa? Or is it more likely that China, with all that experience from home, can do it? I mean, the answer is absolutely obvious. So for the green transition, everyone needs China. There are areas where US may be competitive, even ahead of China. They may be ahead on artificial intelligence. They may be ahead of vaccines. American vaccines seem to work better during COVID than the Chinese. And those are areas where Africa should encourage the United States to do more, not to compete with China where they cannot compete, but supplement China to the benefit of Africa. If, say, Africa say, please, United States, come and set up factories for cheap vaccines. You take out the profit in the European and American market to do innovation, but then you come here and make cheap vaccines for the poor. It will be beneficial for the United States and for Africa, and it will complement Chinese efforts rather than compete with Chinese efforts.
The picture you paint, to me, sounds like a very reasonable one, a very rational one. When you say China is the indispensable partner, not just for Africa, but for the world in terms of the green transition, that's a perspective that here in the West might raise some eyebrows, where the narrative is that, you know, China is a country that at the very least you have to be careful with. How do you view this issue of the debate around is China good or is China bad? What's your response to, or what would your response be to a critique that says, no, you know, don't work with China because you can't trust them?
Obviously, you can trust China. China is the least aggressive major power in the world, and China has not been involved in any military conflict since 1979. Look, the United States have basically been involved in every war anywhere in the world in the last decades, and have largely lost these wars because the enormity of the American military machine cannot be used up in the mountains of Afghanistan, even against a bunch of village boys with some Kalashnikovs up there. So China and the United States is using, say, its veto power in the Security Council of the UN a lot more than China. So China is the least aggressive power. China doesn't export its political system. And of course, no one can import the Chinese political system. There is no way any African or indeed European American nation can import a meritocratic political system which has existed for thousands of years in China. That's a Chinese system. It goes well for the Chinese, but we cannot import it, and we should keep our systems, and then we can have a dialogue with the Chinese. Where China has a weakness is that they are very much consumed with their own honor. Whenever someone is criticizing China in Africa or wherever, China will tend to hit back very hard. If I stand up in this program and I tell you that, say, the President of the United States, Mr. Biden, is a pedophile, he's a crazy guy, he's a mass murderer, he's the most horrible leader ever, well, the American president will do exactly nothing. If you criticize China in that way in an African country, you can expect to get very hard pushback from China because of the concept of honor. So if you compare the United States and China, the United States is intervening everywhere. They have favorite politicians everywhere. Very often they have supported one politician against the other. Most cases with very negative impact, sometimes positive, but most often negative. On China is not involving in the domestic policies of other nations. They don't have a favorite candidate to be the next president of Cameroon, won't support any. They will work with the next president of Cameroon, whoever it is. If it's a dictator, it's a Democrat, somewhere in between, China will work with that person for the benefit of Chinese interests. So China and the United States are not mirror image of each other. The weakness of China is this honor. weakness of America is that they want to interfere basically in every issue all over the planet.
A refreshing perspective. Perhaps a minority perspective for the time being. This debate will, of course, continue. I want to move on a little bit more to and kind of broaden this out back to the issue of multipolarity. And one of the important trends that we're seeing is that African countries are becoming, or seem to be becoming, more influential on certain international platforms and international fora. For example, last year, the African Union was invited to join the G20. We've seen the BRICS country grouping expand. They've added 2 new African countries, Egypt and Ethiopia. Nigeria has indicated that it wants to join the BRICS. That seems to be indicative that the continent, one way or the other, is going to get a stronger voice in terms of shaping world affairs. Do you see that as an opportunity? How might this be leveraged? And do you think that we can expect more of this?
Absolutely. I mean, look, at the moment, the population of Africa is largely the same as the population of China and India. But of course, China and India are much more effective on the global scene, not just because they're richer, but because it's one voice. If Prime Minister Modi speaks, he speaks on behalf of India. Africa has 54 nations, some of them very small market, makes the economy ineffective, but also make the political voice less effective because no one can really speak on behalf of Africa. And currently, Africa may not also have the same level of very visible leaders as Africa had in different other periods, say Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, Obasanjo of Nigeria. They were very visible leaders on the global scene. Kagame of Rwanda is such a leader at the moment, but there are not many very visible African leaders on the global scene. So yes, a stronger voice of Africa in the BRICS. The fact that India helped Africa to get a permanent seat in the G20 should be given credit to India for that. And of course, Africa need to get some permanent representation at the Security Council. Maybe when India joins as a nation, Africa should join as the African Union with a voice there. But for all this to be effective, Africa need to formulate joint positions, and it need visible leaders who can speak on behalf of the continent.
Easier said than done. One thing I would
Absolutely.
like to...
It's very easy to sit there and say this, much more difficult to do it, for sure.
But that doesn't detract from the point. I mean, absolutely a key challenge. And I guess, we are seeing some efforts, some steps towards that. What comes to mind is someone like a William Ruto, who is positioning himself as certainly a champion of Africa's role in the green transition. Kenya hosted the first Africa Climate Summit last September. So hopefully that's an indication that we are heading in the right direction. Do you anticipate that we could see a similar trajectory in terms of bringing Africa into, or sort of giving Africa more of a voice in terms of some of the more traditional institutions that have run global politics and global economics? I'm thinking about, for example, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF. You mentioned the UN Security Council. Are we going to see more of that coming from places like Europe, places like the United States?
I don't think Africa should look for kind of handouts. It's not the United States or Europe, not even China, who will give something to Africa. Africa need to demand, need to get strength, need to improve its economies, which will give strength, and it need to form joint bodies like the African Union with strength, and allow leaders like Ruto and others to speak on behalf of the continent. It's the development in Africa itself who will define and this. No one will give Africa anything for free, unfortunately.
Yeah, sadly, it's hard to argue. I would like to argue with that point, but yeah, I think
I would hope so. I mean, obviously, but look, the World Bank and the Bretton Woods institution has not really adapted to the rise of China. They have not changed the voting rules. That's why China has established some alternative institutions like the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank or the New Development Bank, where South Africa is also party to that. They have done that because they didn't get a fair representation in the World Bank. It will be even harder for Africa just to get that. Africa needs to fight for this. And we who have a love for the continent should of course support that fight, but it starts with Africans themselves.
A message that I suspect will resonate on the continent. Now, you are in Oslo. You're dialing in from Oslo. We, of course, as NABA, we work with Norwegian business, and our mission is to strengthen relations between Norway and African economies. Where does a country like Norway fit into this? Norway is not a member of the EU. It's not a major power, but here, in Norway too, we are seeing a growing sort of awareness that Africa is a continent that you need to engage with. How, in a multipolar context, what does the Norway-Africa relationship look like in this multipolar world that we're moving into? Or perhaps, what should it look like?
In political terms, Europe should follow the advice of President Macron of France, who said that Europe should strive for strategic autonomy, meaning European positions as different from the United States and China and others. That's also good advice to Africa, to strive for strategic autonomy. And that should be the position of Norway also, to be close to our European partners, and from that basis engage with Africa. Of course, then there are obvious areas. I mean, Africa has a very huge advantage in the next decades. Every other part of the world is aging. Every other. I mean, in the last Japanese will close the door in Tokyo in 2300, something like that, if you follow the trajectory of Japan. Korea is the same. China struggle to keep up its large population. And largely everywhere else, there is very few young people. Africa has this enormous potential. That's also, of course, a potential threat, because it may lead to unhappiness and maybe support for extreme groups or terrorists, whatever. All this, you can also think of that. But it's also an enormous opportunity, and it's an enormous opportunity for business to get this right, to get the investment in Africa, which Africa needs. And the obvious areas for Norway is where we have a strength: everything maritime, everything related to shipping, fishing and fish farming, and of course renewables, where we also see, like Scatec has made huge investments in South Africa and Egypt. We should see a lot more of this.
Now, to round off the discussion, I want to sort of zoom out again and look at the big picture here. You're firmly in the camp that we're moving into a multipolar world order. On balance, if we try, and this is being bold given how rapidly things are changing right now, but in the next decade or so, what do you think this is going to do for economic development in emerging regions, and particularly in a region like Africa? Of course, it's impossible to predict, but what might we see? Do you think this is going to be a positive? Do you think that there are going to be challenges, and how might this play out?
Overall, I believe this can be turned into positive. I mean, the big shift in the world in the next decades will be the shift to Asia. And the two Asian giants, China and India, will play a much more important role on the global scene. But also smaller nations like Indonesia. No one is talking about Indonesia. It will be the fourth biggest economy in the world by 2050, passing Germany and Japan. And by 2050, only Germany will be among the 10 biggest economies in the world from the European side. Everyone else will be from the global south, of course, except Japan and the United States. So this rise of Asia gives huge opportunities for Africa. Number one, it's a much more recent development in Asia. Should be easier to link up with companies there, to get investment from Asian companies, to drive production and innovation in Africa. But it also gives the inspiration of very recent developments. If Asia can do this, Africa can do it. This is an issue I sometimes have with my African friends, that I think they should look a lot more to. Why did Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, China, Singapore, why did they do so well? And what is the lessons for Africa? Just one example, I mean, Vietnam is probably the most successful nation in the world when it comes to agriculture. First time I visited Vietnam, there was second biggest. There was absolutely hunger. They were the biggest rice importer in the world. Now they are the second biggest rice exporter in the world. What did Vietnam do? Nothing is rocket science. Very simple things which basically every African nation can do. They provided roads in the countryside. They secured the property rights of the farmers. They provided advice to how to get better products. Very, very simple things, and turn around Vietnam. Singapore, South Korea, they were poorer than Africa. South Korea was poorer than nearly every African nation in 1955. China would have been, even by 1980, poorer than most nations in Africa. Then it took off. So looking into this inspiration, but also the policy tools. I mean, Kagame in Rwanda is an example of a leader who basically is following the Asian playbook to develop his nation. So I believe there are huge potential benefits for Africa in linking up to the rise of Asia. And then Africa will be the next Asia, the next continent to really, really rise.
Well, I think that's as good a note as any to end on. It's going to be fascinating to see how things develop over the next decade and even beyond. No doubt, what is indisputable is that we're living through very interesting and I think potentially quite exciting times. Erik Solheim, all I can say is thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your very honest and to the point opinions. It's been great having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for interest. It's a great discussion.